Okay, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to everyone joining us on our webinar today. My name is Wissam Al-Salibi. I am the director of the Geneva office of the World Evangelical Alliance. I'm honored to be moderating this webinar that we are co-organizing with a host of partner organizations, the World Council of Churches, the Religious Freedom Institute, Middle East Concern, and Open Doors International. We have come together because we believe first and foremost in freedom of religion or belief for all, and we advocate for freedom of religion or belief for all. Second, Algeria is undergoing the Universal Periodic Review on 11 November 2022 before the Human Rights Council. Every country goes through this process, and this is an opportunity for the government of Algeria to make commitments to freedom of religion or belief and to all communities and to human rights in general. In this webinar that we're organizing currently, we would like to highlight the challenges to the question of freedom of religion or belief in Algeria and provide recommendations for the Algerian government to increase access to this right more broadly for all of its citizens. Therefore, I am grateful to have with me today several panelists who will be sharing specifically on this topic. First, I would like to introduce Pastor Salah Chalah. He is the president of the Protestant Church of Algeria. The Protestant Church of Algeria is a member of the World Evangelical Alliance and of the World Council of Churches. Pastor Salah Chalah is joining us from Algeria, and he will be sharing on freedom of religion and belief and the situation of the Protestant churches. Pastor Salah will be speaking mostly in French, and I will be translating. Pastor Salah, donc je viens de vous introduire, et si vous voulez parler en français, je peux vous traduire.
Voilà, juste vous souhaite un grand merci pour cette occasion que vous me donnez pour pouvoir parler un petit peu de la situation des chrétiens en général en Algérie.
Thank you for this opportunity to share about the situations of Christians specifically in Algeria. Allez-y.
Donc, l'Église protestante d'Algérie est une association nationale à caractère national qui a été fondée en 1974.
The Protestant Church of Algeria is an association, a national association founded in 1974.
Agréée par le ministère de l'Intérieur en novembre 1974.
Approved by the Minister of Interior in November 1974.
Actuellement, l'Église protestante d'Algérie représente 47 communautés réparties sur le territoire national.
The Protestant Church of Algeria represents 47 communities all over the national territory of Algeria.
Et malheureusement, depuis juillet 2018 à octobre 2019, on a eu 15 églises mises sous scellé.
Between July 2018 and October 2019, 15 churches were sealed by the authorities, unfortunately.
15 autres églises sur les 45 ont dû fermer suite à des pressions.
Additional 15 churches had to close because of government pressure out of the 45 churches member of the EPA.
Actuellement, on fonctionne qu'à un tiers pratiquement de nos églises.
We currently are operating at 1/3 of our church number as an association.
Et la situation ne semble pas s'améliorer malheureusement.
The situation isn't getting better, unfortunately.
Nous avons en 2020, entre 2019 et 2020, nous nous sommes adressés au président de la République en tant que premier magistrat pour pouvoir apporter une solution, mais ça n'a pas abouti.
Between 2018 and 2020, we addressed the President of the Republic in his capacity of the arbiter, and unfortunately, the situation did not get any better.
On lui a adressé 4 courriers, mais malheureusement pas de réponse jusqu'à aujourd'hui.
We sent him 4 letters for communications, and we have not received a response till date.
Et on a plusieurs cas, plusieurs affaires en justice concernant des individus.
We have
on a,
several court cases currently, several court cases.
voilà, on a un frère qui a sur son dos 14 affaires de justice.
We have a brother with 14 cases before the justice.
Et on a un frère qui est en prison, c'est pour 5 ans à cause d'un partage sur Facebook.
We have a brother who was sentenced and currently in prison for 5 years for having shared something on Facebook.
Et au mois de juin, 4 responsables ont été condamnés à 6 mois de prison avec sursis avec 50 000 dinars d'amende.
And in June of this year, 4 Christian leaders responsible, they were sentenced to 6 months of suspended prison sentence and 50,000 dinars payment.
On a un problème de littérature. Chaque fois, il y a une saisie systématique au niveau des douanes. Quand il y a quelqu'un qui ramène de la littérature dans ses bagages, elle est saisie automatiquement.
We have a problem for importing Christian literature. When people are bringing in Christian literature, there is systematic, the authorities, the customs are taking this Christian literature.
Actuellement, la société biblique algérienne est bloquée sur le plan administratif. On a 2000 ou 3000 Bibles au port qui sont là depuis au moins 8 mois, mais sans pouvoir, sans avoir le droit de les récupérer.
The Bible Society of Algeria has currently 2,000 to 3,000 Bibles stuck at the port of Algiers in the customs. And it's been 8 months now, and we have not been able to bring them into the country.
Tous ces problèmes on a commencé à vivre cette situation difficile à partir de 2006, après la promulgation de la loi 0603 de 2006.
This difficult situation started in 2006 after the passing of the 2006 law.
C'est une loi qui nous semble liberticide parce que c'est cette loi-là que les autorités utilisent pour bloquer, je dirais, pour mener une campagne contre les chrétiens.
This legislation is against freedom. It is being used by the authorities to taking this campaign against the Christians in the country.
Ça nous a rien apporté. Cette loi ne nous a rien apporté en tant que chrétiens, mais au contraire. Il y a juste des fermetures, des menaces de justice, etc.
This 2006 law didn't bring us anything positive as a Christian community. It only brought us problems.
Voilà, c'est ce que nous essayons d'interpeller et de sensibiliser l'opinion. C'est ce qu'on a fait jusqu'à 2021, de sensibiliser l'opinion nationale et internationale. Mais jusqu'à maintenant, on n'a pas vu une amélioration de la situation des chrétiens en général en Algérie.
So we are trying to raise awareness in Algeria and globally about what is happening in Algeria in the hopes that the situation will get better, but it is not getting better.
On espère qu'il y aura du meilleur à l'avenir.
We hope for the better in the future.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Salah. Now I will take over my role as the moderator, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Mr. Amjad Mahmood Khan. Mr. Khan teaches and practices law at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he is a member of the adjunct faculty since 2014. He is a lawyer and law professor for 2 decades, and he volunteers as the National Secretary of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA. Mr. Khan, it is a great pleasure and honor to have you on this panel and to hear about the situation of the Ahmadiyya in Algeria. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Wissam, and to all my co-panelists and to everyone who's joined this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor and privilege. I wanted to express my deepest solidarity with Pastor Chalah and his comments and what he said. Very disturbing, the conditions for Christians in Algeria. My heart goes out to all of my co-religionists in Algeria, those who are suffering simply for being Christian. It's unconscionable that that's happening in 2022. And as a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and I can say on behalf of all Ahmadi Muslims, we have deep anguish over the inability of any Christian to profess their faith or practice their faith. It pains us. It affects all of us. So we stand in solidarity with you as well. I appreciate the opportunity just to spend a few minutes talking about the situation of the Ahmadi community in Algeria. I think some of you may be aware of generally the Ahmadi Muslim belief system. Ahmadi Muslims profess to be Muslim, but because of their particular beliefs, a large part of the Muslim world has deemed Ahmadis to be not Muslim. This is most prominent in Pakistan, where there is a constitutional amendment declaring Ahmadis as non-Muslim. But of course, Ahmadis are millions strong across the world, in over 220 countries and territories, a very organized community, moderate, orthodox, in fact, orthodox, even though they're viewed as heterodox. They follow the Hanafi school of thought, but it's a messianic revival movement within Islam. And because of the belief system of the Ahmadis believing in a subordinate prophet to the Prophet Muhammad, this has created a situation where Ahmadis are deemed to be non-Muslim. And this legal entrenchment has created a number of issues for Ahmadi Muslims that are quite severe around the world. And this has now surfaced in the last number of years in Algeria. Although there have been Ahmadis in Algeria as early as the 1920s, the community really had its growth in 2006. It had a growth of 10 years in that time, close to 2,000 Ahmadis who are Algerian. And because of that growth, the Ahmadis sought to purchase and construct a mosque of their own and a place of worship, because it was so difficult to meet privately. And in February of 2016, the community began building a center and applied for a permit. And this created a huge problem for the Ahmadis. The application was quickly rejected in May of that year. And that created a large issue where there were arrests and prosecution of Ahmadis. This was a full-scale defamatory campaign against the community. It lasted for about 3 years. It included raids, detentions, arrests, court cases, sentencing, pressuring employers to dismiss Ahmadis, the teardown of that community center that was being built, and then a media propaganda fueled by the Minister of Religious Affairs. At that time, more than 100 Ahmadis across the country were arrested, some rearrested numerous times. And there was some international pressure that assisted, but then that stopped. And then in 2020, there were a number of court cases and prison sentences that took place throughout Algeria and various provinces. In the northeastern city of Chalah, there was 7 Ahmadi Muslims who were arrested. They had 5-year prison sentences. In December of 2020, the court had rendered judgments on 31 cases in TCOSU. Several of those remained arrested and prosecuted, and in Adrar as well, there were imprisonments, and even today there are Ahmadis who are in prison. And this has led to a number of offenses and charges. Some of those stem from denigrating the precepts of Islam, which is a punishable offense under the Penal Code, possession and distribution of documents from foreign sources, threatening national security. Of course, Ahmadis don't have any such literature, but that's the charge against them. Participation in unauthorized associations, collecting donations without a license, and then, of course, conducting worship as well. All of these have become, arrestable offenses. And this is very problematic because for Ahmadis who are very peaceful, a peace-loving community, these are very unconscionable charges against them. And, they feel attacked at their core beliefs. So since 2016, 292 Ahmadis have been prosecuted across 5 cities. There were more than 280 cases that the Supreme Court of Algeria has heard or had pending. 26 Ahmadi Muslims spent between 2 and 7 months in jail, all on charges that relate to the religious affiliation. There continues to be an Ahmadi in prison in Adrar. There's cases pending throughout Algeria. And I should say these are men and women as well. Many members of the Ahmadi community who are women have also had families split apart, the husbands and the wives split apart, stripped from their ability to be with their children. So it's quite a remarkable situation. I will say that this has also led to fines, a number of fines that have taken place, and this is quite an ordeal. There's been over almost 55,000 pounds of fines equivalent that Ahmadis have had to pay. So in some cases, passports have been seized. There has been a few acquittals of Ahmadis in court proceedings and some appeals that are pending, but 33 Ahmadis were convicted with prison sentences over the last few years. There's extreme scrutiny on every meeting of an Ahmadi. Intelligence services monitor Ahmadi movements. This has created a lot of problems, and the points of concern are the inability to incorporate as a religious association. There had been, of course, a constitutional change that allowed for more freedom, but that has not led to legal certainty in freedom of association, religious association, which is in violation even of the new constitution. And this, of course, is unacceptable. And I will say here at the end that there are several recommendations that I would make that I've presented in US Congress as well, that I wish to share here to all of you, that of course we would call for the release of all Ahmadi Muslims in prison or facing prosecution, allow Ahmadis to register as an association without the undue burden by the local provinces. This is very important and it hasn't happened, and this has led to the legal problems that Ahmadis face, being arrested or rearrested, then released or split apart from their families. And then under the newly adopted constitution in December of 2020, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Algeria should be free to incorporate and reopen their respective associations and houses of worship in Algeria. There are several thousand Ahmadis now. It's a growing community. The Ahmadis have served with distinction in Algeria. About 60 years ago, it's interesting, it's October of 2022 now, but in October of 1962, when Algeria became independent and it was admitted to the United Nations as the 109th member of the UNO, it was an Ahmadi, Sir Zafrullah Khan, who was the president of the United Nations, who helped achieve the independence of the country of Algeria, an Ahmadi. And so Ahmadis have served Algeria with such distinction, even allowing for the country to have independence. And Zafrullah Khan was an Ahmadi, and everyone knew he was an Ahmadi, and he served Algeria and the Algerian people through this amazing historic, green and white flag that was raised about 60 years ago. And here we are as Ahmadis languishing in prison, prosecuted and persecuted. So there's a massive irony there. It's a tragedy, really. And I hope that the people of Algeria and the government officials recognize how Ahmadis have served the country and that they shouldn't be treated as second-class citizens in this type of environment, and they should be allowed to call themselves and profess to be Muslim. So that's all for now. I look forward to questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Thank you. I admit that I was not aware personally of everything you just said. I'm very grateful for what you shared. And I could see the intersection between some of what you're facing and some of what Pastor Salah Chalah mentioned about the places of worship, the legal dilemma and the lack of recognition, the court cases. So thank you. Now, and we'd like to turn now to Mrs. Lena Abboud. And Mrs. Lena Abboud is Senior Manager for Research and Policy for the Middle East Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute. She oversees the team's research and policy initiative across the region. So, Mrs. Abboud, I give you now the floor in the hope that you can also help us shed more light on the legal and policy issues, challenges that Pastor Salah and Mr. Khan touched upon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wissam, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be joining the panel today alongside my fellow panelists. I think it's so critically important that we're able to hear from the communities that are experiencing these challenges within the country, and a great opportunity to learn more about the historical context as well as the lived reality of a lot of these community members on a day-to-day basis in Algeria. And the Universal Periodic Review process within the UN Human Rights Council is such an important opportunity to monitor trends in human rights conditions, including freedom of religion or belief in UN member states. And today, it's my hope that I'm able to share some findings from research that we've conducted within Algeria on behalf of the Middle East Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute. So over the next few minutes, I'm just going to provide an overview of what we refer to as the religious freedom landscape of Algeria. And this will include a brief analysis of the legal, political, social, and even the historical conditions that shape this right across the country. And I'll also provide an overview of some of the specific legal challenges that were mentioned today, and hope to offer a few recommendations of practical steps that the Algerian government can take to advance freedom of religion or belief and other important associated rights like freedom of association or even freedom of expression for all Algerians. So as we begin to discuss religious freedom as a human right in Algeria, I think it's helpful to consider the demography and the history of the country. Nearly 99% of Algerians are Sunni Muslim, and this identity has become a dominant and consequential characteristic of Algerian culture and governance. A small minority, just about 1% of the population, are non-Sunni Muslim, and this includes the Ahmadis, the Christians, Ibadi Muslims, Jews, and Shia Muslims. And then, of course, within these demographics, there are also secular and atheist Algerians that are represented. Now, from the government perspective, establishing and protecting this Sunni Muslim identity has been a significant priority since independence. These efforts are, of course, informed by the French occupation of Algeria, as well as the rise of Islamist movements that threatened the government leading up to and all throughout the Algerian Civil War. And so as a result, the state has gone to great lengths to protect itself from any perceived threat or foreign influence. Now, consequently, fundamental freedoms like freedom of religion or belief have become increasingly repressed in this process. I think it's important to note that despite the government suggesting that Protestant Christians or members of the Ahmadiyya or even Shia communities are propagating foreign influence or ideas, the vast majority of members of these groups are indigenous Algerians. They're not actually foreigners. And so in terms of the legal landscape for freedom of religion or belief, the state has often used the legislative office to not only promote values and practices that are fundamental to its Sunni Muslim identity, but to also criminalize and mitigate practices they perceive as a threat. And we've heard some examples of this from the previous panelists. Now, constitutionally, Islam is enshrined as the official religion of the state, and Islamic practice is regulated by the government. Any insult to the Prophet Muhammad or Islam carries significant penalties and fines under the criminal code. There are some provisions for freedom of worship and expression, but there are also several laws and policies that restrict the full exercise of these rights for all Algerians. The constitutional referendum of 2020 maintained freedom of worship if it is exercised with respect for Algerian law, but freedom of conscience, which has been included in every single constitution since the state's independence, was notably omitted altogether. As mentioned by previous panelists, Law 0603 of 2006, which is entitled Governing the Practice of Religions Other than Islam, imposes restrictions on non-Muslim religious groups as they practice their respective faiths. Article 5 of this law stipulates that places of worship must be approved by a national committee for non-Muslim worship. Article 11 of the law imposes penalties of imprisonment or steep fines for sharing any information aimed at shaking the faith of a Muslim. And per Article 13 of the law, hosting worship activities in buildings that are not designated for religious practice is also criminalized. Now, the 2012 law on associations required all associations across the country to re-register under new guidelines, and this law was effectively used to withhold formal registration approval from some religious groups. In effect, those religious communities who were not able to get the registration approval from the government are forced with a difficult choice. They can choose between not organizing at all or doing so illegally. There are also criminal laws protecting national constants and interests that have been used to repress religious communities that the government has historically perceived as a threat. We heard from my fellow panelists about the experience of the Ahmadiyya community, and the Shia Muslim community has also had similar experiences. And it's important to note that it's not only religious minorities who can experience this, but even members of the Sunni Muslim majority or secular or atheist Algerians who share diverse or dissenting opinions can also be charged or penalized under many of these laws. Also, religious affiliated NGOs or non-governmental organizations are vulnerable to the government's policies. And this is, of course, apparent and even applicable to foreign organizations. The government just requested earlier this month that Caritas, an international Catholic humanitarian aid organization, cease all activities. And they've been working in the country since its independence, or actually a few days after its independence. And no detailed justification for this closure was given to the bishops of the Catholic Church in Algeria. As Algeria approaches its Universal Periodic Review, RFI would like to offer a few recommendations for the Algerian government to consider, just in light of the ongoing and increasing challenges and restrictions that religious minorities are facing across the country. First, we want to encourage the government of Algeria to acknowledge or recognize members of the religious minority community within the broader context of Algeria's national identity. Historically, the Algerian culture is very diverse, with representation from many different religions. And I think it's critical that those religious communities, especially those that are continuing to grow and thrive, even under such significant restrictions, are recognized as, in fact, Algerian and critical to the Algerian identity and culture. And this can be done more directly by affirming their rights as part of the National Action Plan that the government initiated in 2021. And this plan was intended to promote and strengthen the national identity and memory of the country. We also encourage the government to permit religious groups to register, organize, and carry out their peaceful religious practices. This would require that the government approve outstanding registrations, reopen sealed places of worship, and stop unwarranted detention and harassment of religious minorities or other Algerians with dissenting and diverse voices. And finally, we would also advocate for the reform of those laws and policies that direct or indirectly restrict these rights. So this includes Law 0603, the 2012 Law on Associations, as well as components of the criminal code that repress freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression and association and other associated rights. And as I conclude my time, I plan to include a link to RFI's landscape report on Algeria for those participants who are interested in learning more. And so I'll plan to include that link in the chat, and it's also available on RFI's website. But with that, I will conclude my time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Abboud, for your contribution and also for clarifying several of the legal elements and national elements in Algeria. Can you hear us? Okay. Can hear, okay. Now I would like to turn to the question and answers. All the attendees can send their questions via the Q&A. You can send your questions and ask a few questions. Now I have the first question I'd like to ask is to Mr. Khan, because you said that you will have to leave at some point for a law case. The first question I would like to ask you is, European governments and Western governments in general, but also governments all over the world, are considering what to recommend as part of the Universal Periodic Review to the government of Algeria. What would your message be? What are the 1 or 2 urgent and important top priority recommendations to make that would be helpful for freedom of religion or belief in Algeria?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's very important. Obviously, the Universal Periodic Review is an excellent opportunity for member states to register their concerns and questions. I would prioritize mentioning the commitments that Algeria has made to human rights. It is important that the accessions to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights be highlighted, because Algeria, even as I mentioned and alluded in my opening about the founding and history of Algeria, there has been a deep commitment to religious freedom, but unfortunately that religious freedom doesn't extend evenly and fairly, and that's in violation of Article 18, 19, 20, and 27 of the ICCPR. There's optional protocol provisions as well, and Algeria has to be accountable for that. And specifically, the profession of faith is very important. The ability to freely profess your faith and self-identify, for Ahmadi to self-identify as Muslim is very important. Anyone who is forced to disavow their own identity is effectively being put on a path, a perilous path, where they will have to be arrested and charged as criminals just because of their profession of faith. This is anathema to everything that the ICCPR stands for. So it's fundamental that in the UPR, member states and those who are having side events or advocating, like the Religious Freedom Institute and many other groups who are doing such an admirable job in raising these issues, hold Algeria accountable under existing covenants and commitments that they themselves have heralded it as being important in 2022. Not every member state, and certainly not every country, has committed in the way that Algeria has. So they should be held accountable for those commitments. So that's number one. Number two, I would say that in terms of freedom of association, I think this is an underlying issue. It was just highlighted by the prior speakers. Association is elemental to freedom of religion. We sometimes forget association is so essential to public acts of worship or devotion. The ability to privately worship is important, but public acts of worship or devotion are an inescapable part of being a Christian, of being an Ahmadi, of being a Shia, of being any type of religious community. Your ability to publicly profess your faith, proclaim your faith, witness your faith, proselytize your faith, which may be further along, but just simply being who you are and professing that faith in congregation publicly is absolutely an inextricable link to freedom of religion. And we forget about that. And we take that for granted. Here in the United States, association rights are so sacrosanct. But in Algeria, those rights seem to be eroded and deteriorated rapidly. And so it's our obligation to hold Algeria accountable to a freedom of association rights, and to do so under the new constitutional framework, and to make it easy for associations to register without fines or threat of imprisonment. So those are a few recommendations that are top mind for me.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Now I will ask a question to Pastor Salah Chalah. I will ask it in English, then in French, puis en français, and I will translate the answer. So there were two questions, Pastor Salah Chalah, in the chat box. One related to what could Western governments, how could they support you more than what they are doing? Another question was about, why aren't the cases more publicized in Europe and elsewhere, the cases of what is happening with Algeria. Donc, Pasteur Salah, je vais vous adresser deux questions auxquelles vous pouvez répondre et je traduirai. Une question, c'est que peuvent faire les gouvernements en général, notamment certains gouvernements qui communiquent avec le gouvernement algérien, qu'est-ce qu'ils peuvent faire et dire concernant la situation de l'EPA et des églises. Il y a une autre question, pourquoi il n'y a pas plus de couverture médiatique et globale sur les questions de l'église et de ce qui se passe en Algérie. Donc, si vous voulez répondre, et moi je traduirai. Attends, il faut que j'enlève le microphone. C'est bon, allez-y.
OK. Donc, pour la première question, que doivent faire les gouvernements européens, je pense qu'ils font déjà un bon travail de sensibilisation. C'est juste que il faut que notre gouvernement Il faut que l'Algérie comprenne que finalement la diversité religieuse n'est pas une menace pour l'unité nationale.
Okay, so European governments globally are doing good work and good support for Algeria, but for the churches. But it is important for our government to understand that diversity is important for national unity.
L'exemple, on peut le tirer des pays européens. Malgré toute la diversité religieuse, quand même, c'est des pays où il y a une paix, une unité nationale, nous le voyons. Donc, c'est des exemples si les autorités algériennes décident de faire comme font les Européens par rapport à cette diversité religieuse.
European nations are diverse. They have national diversity of religious communities, and yet we can see that they are the unified nations. They are able to act as a nation, and the Algerian government can follow these models for dealing with diversity and religious communities in Algeria.
Et pour la deuxième question par rapport aux médias, je pense que la peur, la peur a joué a influencé négativement pour les médias ont des difficultés à parler de notre situation parce qu'ils ont peur des persécutions, des répercussions négatives sur le média lui-même.
Regarding the media, Pastor Salah said that the media in Algeria is afraid of raising up the cases too much for fear of backlash, repercussion on the media itself.
Nous, en tant qu'EPA, entre l'année 2019 et 2020, on était très actifs sur le terrain, mais malheureusement, avec la fermeture, avec cette nouvelle politique de tout sécuritaire, on a préféré, nous aussi, ne pas beaucoup en parler publiquement.
The EPA, up until 2021, we were very active and present in the field, on the terrain, and in advocacy. However, after the all-security approach of the current government to this affair, we have preferred not to continue speaking up.
Je pense qu'à notre niveau maintenant, c'est d'être beaucoup plus sage et puis laisser le Seigneur, parce que nous sommes croyants, nous devons laisser le Seigneur faire sa part maintenant.
So now we would like to be more wise, and at the same time, we are believers, so we would like to leave the Lord to do His work and His bidding now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Salah for sharing. I have one more question, if you could answer it quickly, Pastor Salah, which is the question that I've heard that the Algerian government usually says that the houses of worship and the churches are actually restaurants or for other purposes than churches, and therefore they closed the 15 churches that they closed, or 16 churches were not really churches. The buildings had other purposes, and that's what they said to in the United Nations here in Geneva and their communication, and to other government officials. What is your response to that? Donc le gouvernement algérien répond que les églises ne sont pas des immeubles d'église, mais c'est des immeubles pour d'autres affaires, que ce soit des restaurants, autre chose. Quelle est votre réponse?
C'est une réalité, mais je dirais tout simplement qu'on était obligé de transformer nos appartements, nos logements ou nos restaurants à des lieux de culte parce que les autorités ne nous donnent pas la possibilité de construire des lieux de culte.
We were obliged to turn our apartments, our restaurant, our other buildings into places of worship because the authorities did not give us a license or the authorization to build our own places of worship.
On a fait une demande de construction d'un lieu de culte dans une région de Kabylie. On est à la 6e année ou la 7e année sans réponse.
6 or 7 years ago, we submitted a request to build a church building in the Kabylie region. It's been 6 or 7 years without any answer from the government to build this building.
Ils nous ont demandé de faire de fournir un dossier. C'est ce qu'on avait fait. Donc cette région, c'est Abboud. C'est une région qui s'appelle Abboud. On a tout fourni. On a un terrain au nom de l'Église protestante d'Algérie. On a fourni le plan de construction. On a fait tout le nécessaire, mais sans réponse.
So in the village or the area of Abboud in Algiers, we have a plot of land owned by the Protestant Church of Algeria, and we have submitted the plans, the construction plans, and all the required documents to the government for approval, and we have yet to hear an answer from the government.
On nous a demandé de fournir des dossiers au niveau de la wilaya de Tizi Ouzou pour régulariser quelques églises. On a fourni 3 dossiers, mais ça fait 4 ans, ils n'ont pas de réponse.
In the wilaya of Tizi Ouzou, they requested files to regularize, correct the situation of several churches, of 3 churches. We submitted all the documents, and it's been 4 years now without answer from the government.
Donc, voilà, c'est la situation que nous vivons. C'est pour comment dirais-je, c'est pas de notre faute, je veux dire, c'est pas de notre faute si nous transformons des lieux d'habitation en lieux de culte. C'est la situation qui nous oblige d'agir comme ça.
It is not our fault that we had to convert some places that we live to places of worship because we are obliged to do so, because that's the situation that we have been put in by the government. Merci, Pastor Salah. Thank you, Pastor Salah. And I see that there's a question to Mr. Khan, who is trying to answer in written. If the Supreme Court has given judgments concerning the Ahmadis, would you like to answer orally or in written?
I can cover it. So that the answer is yes. There have been a number of judgments. Those are worth review and analysis. In 2016, there were ordinances restricting freedom of association and specifically the ability to build a mosque, which I mentioned for the Ahmadi community. And that was on the grounds that Ahmadis were kufr, disbelievers, people who were posing as Muslims and therefore a threat to the stability of society. This is the same type of arguments that prosecutors had advanced in a number of these cases throughout Algeria with respect to a number of Ahmadis. In many cases, those sentences by the government were affirmed by the court with similar grounds, arguing that there's essentially a law and order situation that would allow a government interest to prevail to protect the majority by not allowing anyone who is an Ahmadi who would be a threat, in the sense that threat with air quotes, in the sense that they're professing to be Muslim, but they're not really Muslim. They're infidels, or they're disbelievers, or they're heretical. And these were specifically in the judgments themselves. So this is very problematic. We've seen this pattern before in Pakistan, where Ahmadis were punished for posing as Muslims, being essentially fake Muslims. And this is the kind of argumentation that courts have advanced as well. But I would say here that one of the quote unquote exceptions to Articles 18, 19, 20, and 27 of the ICCPR is this idea of order public, this public order exception, that if there's a public order reason to restrict religious freedom, you can. But it's been made very clear by the United Nations in various different comments that exception should not swallow the right by forcing a view of essentially making religious adherents blasphemers. And they specifically cited Ahmadis, if by virtue of just being an Ahmadi, if you are insulting the majority Muslim Sunni belief as blasphemy, then you would be a criminal. And if that was allowed in the name of public order, then that would basically defeat the essence of the entire important fundamental right. So that exception cannot be abused by governments. So Algeria should not be allowed to invoke that exception in order to end around their international obligations. So this is a very important point that everyone should bear in mind, that people invoke this exception as a way to end around fundamental rights, but that right is not accepted, that exception does not apply it's non-derogable. It's a fundamental right, and you can't use that exception as a way to suffocate rights of self-identification. And this is why Ahmadis really are in a paralysis when it comes to the legalities in Algeria and elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Lena, would you like to provide a closing remarks? And also, what do you believe are, like, if governments are trying to, prepare their recommendations for Algeria, what would be the top recommendations related to freedom of religion belief you believe should be made by the governments during the UPR of Algeria? And if you can also give us some closing remarks, and then we can close at that point.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think just to reiterate what the co-panelists have been discussing in their own responses to some of the questions, when we discuss, public order or national security, or a lot of these concerns, which are not unique to Algeria, I think kind of across the board, we see some governments try to exercise these exceptions as a means to either restrict the rights of religious groups within their countries, or otherwise kind of mitigate some of their practices. And I think it's important to recognize that those exceptions, actually don't apply to freedom of religion or belief, that in the UN General Comment 22, ICCPR, and a number of other comments and statements made from the United Nations, national security is never really an opportunity to disproportionately restrict particular religious groups over others under any circumstances. And so I think it's important for those governments, whether they're European governments, United States governments, or even governments broadly across the region, to continue to engage the government of Algeria on these issues, and to continue to prioritize them in diplomatic discussions. I think there's many examples of how religious minority communities, in particular, the Ahmadis and the Christian communities that we've heard from today, are trying very sincerely to, follow the legal standards and legal frameworks that the Algerian government has put in place in order to have official permission to organize, official permission to associate, and official permission under the government standards and government regulations to practice their religious beliefs freely, alone, and in community with others. And so I think one particular point that would be interesting just moving forward is, even under Law 0603, there's the Committee for Non-Muslim Worship that's been established to kind of regulate the worship and practices of non-Muslim religious communities across the country. And in much of our research, we found it interesting that while representatives of a number of offices, including the Executive Office, the Human Rights Council, the National Police, and the Ministry of the Interior, Defense, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs are members of this Committee for Non-Muslim Worship, there is no real evidence that they have even met or that they've been actively working on a number of these issues in terms of regulating non-Muslim worship across the country. And so to that end, I think it's imperative that even within the legal frameworks that are in place, as these religious communities like the EPA and the Ahmadiyya community and others are seeking to establish formal recognition and formal permissions to worship and practice their religions freely, that there is engagement with the Algerian government to see in what way they're meeting them and what that process actively looks like, so that those who are trying to seek these permissions and affirm their rights are actually able to effectively do so within the system that they've developed. And I also think that it just requires persistence. And also, I think it's important for those communities who are experiencing these challenges within Algeria to maintain ongoing communication with those governments, with partners, and with advocacy organizations, so that we're able to communicate effectively what's taking place on the ground, and to support in whatever way that we can to ensure that freedom of religion or belief and associated rights are really affirmed for all Algerians, regardless of their religion or belief.
Thank you, Mrs. Abboud, and thank you, Pastor Salah, and thank you, Mr. Khan, Amjad Mahmood Khan, for this panel, for our webinar today. Thank you for sharing about the various aspects of the challenges to freedom of religion and belief for the Christian communities, for the Ahmadiyya communities, and also for other religious communities that were mentioned, whether Jewish groups, Shia groups, and other groups. And thank you, panelists, for joining us on this panel. And it is our hope that you all follow what is on 11 November, the UPR of Algeria. We hope that governments, not only the governments of the world all over, will emphasize the importance of freedom of religion and belief, but also as part of the UPR process, we call on the government of Algeria to accept the recommendations related to freedom of religion or belief and to act upon them and to allow for the churches and for the places of worship and for mosques to be built, opened, and to put an end to the court cases against all these minorities and to enshrine and strengthen freedom of religion or belief. And as Pastor Salah Chalah mentioned, that diversity is a positive thing. If governments are able to manage it correctly, they can build national unity using diversity. Again, thank you for all the panelists and thank you for the participants for being with us today. And wishing you a good afternoon or a good start of your day, depending where you are. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.